our good friend Miriam Bankovsky and her volume, Economics of the Family, a Social and Political History. Please.
Thank you very much. And thank you to both Manuela and Giando for the invitation to speak with you today. It's a pleasure because I don't have very many opportunities to speak to historians of economic thought in Australia. And it's lovely to be speaking with you in the virtual space. Thank you very much for organising this, both of you. I'll share with you my slide. Hang on a sec. Can you see this okay?
We can see. If you can put on presentation mode, that's fantastic. Thank you.
That works well. Thank you. As you know, my name's Miriam Bankovsky, and I'm located in Australia at a university called La Trobe University in Melbourne. My book, I should also say that I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country, the land on which my university is located is on Indigenous land. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today I'm going to talk to you about my book, Economics and the Family, A Social and Political History. In this book, I came to this book. I think maybe it's useful for you to know how I came to this, being based in Australia without very much access to the sorts of organisations that are strong in Europe and America in history of economic thought. So my background was in political philosophy, but when I came to La Trobe University in around 2010, it was to teach into a degree called the Bachelor of Politics, Philosophy and Economics. And through that teaching, I came to meet a professor who's now an emeritus professor called John King. I'm not sure if many of you know John King, but my first experience really in trying to think through how to teach the bridging units in the politics, philosophy and economics degree was a subject that we decided to co-teach together in 2012 called Economics and Ethics. And it was a lot of fun to teach because I came from a political philosophy background and John King came from heterodox economics and history of economic thought. And thanks to many conversations, many long walks around the suburb of Greensboro, which is where John lives, around the Plenty River, and over time teaching and getting to know the ideas that were interesting to me because I was trying to teach bridging units in politics, philosophy and economics, which meant that I was trying to answer
Can you see? Can you hear her? La sentite?
No, she's freezed.
Okay. So let me. Io non ho il suo cellulare, quindi adesso le scriverò una mail. L'ho scritto in chat. Interrompo la registrazione un attimo.
judgments had informed the development of economics with a focus on how economists had studied families. So that's how I became interested in this, and how then I started to read and think. And through that grant, I was able to access library material. I ordered all of Hazel Kirk's books, for example, all of Margaret Reed's books from the different libraries. I had a research assistant to photocopy them, to digitize them. I gradually found myself piecing together this history with clues from John. And I really do mean that. I think I wouldn't have been able to really access how to think through, how to grapple with the key geographical and temporal locations that were important without some clues and hints that I then explored. So that's an answer to a question that I received recently about how I came to this topic at all, given that in 2010, I really came from political philosophy. So now the topic. In my book, what I want to show is how economics and the way that economists, disciplinary economists recognized by the discipline as such, studied the family. And it's hard to talk about a book in 25 minutes. So, and I found that in philosophy, philosophers have been interested in theories of justice. And so through the lens of studying families, through the lens of concerns with emancipation or justice, how families had promoted or undermined freedom, I realized that in sociology, there'd been a huge number of studies done on family through a sociological lens, looking at the functions that the family had played in different periods and in diverse cultures, looking at the importance of the family to the emergence of industrial economies and the functions that they played. But it seemed to me that there were no equivalent histories of the family in economic thought. And yet many economists were writing about the family. There was also a curious claim that cropped up everywhere, even in feminist economics, that the economics of the family only began from the 1960s onwards with work by Gary Becker and by Labour economists. Rational choice approaches to economics in the new household economics, and labour market analyses of the role of women in the workplace and the impact on families and the like. And I found this a curious claim because it seemed like economists had long studied the family. The family was central to the work of Alfred Marshall, who drew on Hegel's account of, who as a young man seemed to me to have drawn on Hegel's work on family in his readings on the history of Western civilization. And then through the principles of economics. So I decided that I would try to show how theories of the family in economics were really centered on poverty in ways that were quite different to the sociological focus on functions and the philosophical focus on emancipation and justice. Economists seem to be always interested in the question of poverty, which was quite different. So I also noticed that there were some really lovely studies of family economics in work by people like Agnes Latolik. who tried to show that there were themes emerging in the work of the old family economists, as I call them, Kirk, Margaret Reed, Elizabeth Hoyt, that were then taken up by Becchio and others, and that the fragmentation of family economics was, and the loss of attention to family economics was the result, Agnes Latolik thought, of disciplinary professionalization, which meant that the study of women's work had been lost to economics, even though there were themes that could be traced across the different periods that she looked at. But it seemed to me that when looking back at history, being informed by the feminist interest from the late 1980s onwards in recovering the lost careers and thinking of women in times past, it also seemed to me that what had not been done in this telling of these stories about family in economic thought was to locate them very strongly in their social and political context, and not just in a context of disciplinary forgetting. The stories that had been told in Agnes Latolik's manner, which were excellent, were about how this story had been lost because of disciplinary professionalization, which then no longer included these stories as part of economics. But I wanted to do something different. I wanted to show that there was another way of telling this story by locating the work of these women who were working on family, and also the theories of family by the disciplinary economists whose work on families had also been forgotten, in Marshall, in Pareto, in although we know Manuela Mosca has done great work on Pareto, and so have other Italian economists like Claudia Sonna and so forth. But I wanted to really locate these in their social and political context to try and show that methodologies, economic methodologies, emerge in time in response to the social and political problems that are shouldered by the economists, the problems that they see as important to them. And so this is how I structured my book, temporally around the poverty of the Victorian factory families and Alfred Marshall shouldering this problem. A similar problem, but one more focused on agrarian family poverty in the work of the early Lausanne economists Pareto and Voros, because of the later industrialization in Italy, comparative to Britain. The problem shouldered by the old family economists was not about how to contribute to production, how families would assist in building and supporting a labor force to contribute to production, but instead the problem was different. It was about how to improve family consumption, because now across the channel in America, one saw the birth of the production in factories of labor-saving devices, which did not exist anywhere in the world. And so this left economists, family economists, wanting to study family consumption. Again, from the 1960s onwards, I track how the new household economists also saw poverty as a problem, but depicted it and the role of family as responsive to a need for human capital, deficits in human capital, particularly in Black families for Gary Becker and other human capital theorists, where the problem was the having of children by those who should be investing in the human capital of children they already had, rather than aggravating poverty by having children when they could not afford to invest in their human capital. A different way of viewing poverty and the role of family in the cultivation of that, which I show in my book to be a response to and a rejection of the dominant ways of thinking about poverty in the war on poverty period. And then I turn to the feminist work. So let me take you a little bit then through very briefly about this approach then. So the approach is to try to map out the social and political problems shouldered by the economists in each of these periods in the late 19th century in Britain, in the work of the Italian economists who were Lausanne, really, Italian, and Swiss French, Voras. So, and then I really wanted to show that the methodologies and theories of family behaviour and the policies proposed were responsive to those problems that were shouldered by the economists. And in each of the chapters, I built in a critical reflection by trying to show that even on their own terms, in their own histories and in their own times, there were certain problems that were overlooked and even deepened by the sorts of policies proposed. In a short presentation to you, and I hope you will ask me questions, I can't really give a good sense of the chapters. So I'm really trying to show you where this came from, why I was interested, how I approached the topic, as an invitation, if you like this kind of approach, to delve more deeply into it yourself and maybe read it there. So that's what I do in the first chapter. I map out really why the topic's important, why sociologists and philosophers are quite different in their approach, why I do really find the approaches to the family of feminist-inspired history of economic thought to be very useful, but why it's only part of the story, because it's really focused on disciplinary professionalisation and recovering careers rather than, in my view, really locating the telling of this story in a historical narrative about methodology as responsive to social and political problems, and methodological change as responsive to social and political change, not just to problems internal to the discipline about professionalisation. In the second chapter then, I go to more closely to Alfred Marshall and the Victorian factory families and their pinching sorrow. There, I find, just give me one moment to find that, the start of that chapter. There I draw on literature like Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South to really try and centre that work in the poverty of the Victorian factory families, and Marshall's concern to improve the labour productivity of the factory families, to try to show how the family is the unit that is meant to cultivate labour productivity. And using that tripart approach, I also bring a critical perspective to that. I show that the family economics that Alfred Marshall develops out of his engagement with Malthus and others end up with a gendered account of the family that did not notice that the defence of a breadwinner wage as a means to promote and recognise the labour of women in the home was not being handed back to women as mothers or to children. and high levels of abandonment and desertion left women needing to offer new services to the market, laundries, home cooking, in ways that Marshall didn't notice, but somebody like Eleanor Rathbone did. High levels of domestic violence, of assault and abandonment. So I turn, as I mentioned, to the Lausanne economists, because there I find that they're interested more in, they're less focused as Marshall and the British economists are on the family's role in industrial, in industrial economies in Britain's north. But they're also still concerned with agrarian poverty because of the poverty in the south. And I know I'm talking to experts here, so I'll leave you to read this chapter and see what you think. For me, my favorite chapter of the book is the chapter on low-income interwar family consumption in the United States. So I try to show that Alfred Marshall, Pareto, Voros, they were all very much thinking about the family as contributing to improving labour productivity. And they wanted to make sure that the family's contribution to production was not exceeded by its contribution to population, that families were not having more children than their contribution to production could sustain. But it's a very, very different approach in the United States from the in the first 20 years and onwards of the 20th century. Why? Because we see some forms of interesting consumption for low-income families, where a lot of that consumption was still being produced at home in the other economies in Britain and Europe. In America, we see that factories are starting to produce shoes, clothes. They're producing irons, the first fridges, labour-saving devices at home, the first washing machines. This is leading into the Roaring 20s, where factories are producing for the consumption of the very women who are now starting to work in these factories to produce the goods that they want for their own homes. And we see Hazel Kirk, Elizabeth Hoyt, and Margaret Reed. Margaret Reed explicitly refers to the work of Sinclair Lewis Babbitt, which was a bestseller about the shift from families from old tenement working suburbs to banging new suburbs in their outer suburbs of Midwest cities, where everybody could aspire to own a fully detached house with its own internal laundry and its own internal kitchen and a bathroom. And this meant a need for producing those labour-saving devices that these families needed in their suburban homes. And it also was associated with a desire for recognition among other families, for status, the expanding middle class. And these economists were contributing to how low-income families might consume more rationally and not just produce. Contribute to labour productivity wasn't so important to them as how to rationalise family consumption in a context that was very different to Britain and Italy at that time, where there really were not so many consumable goods for low-income families, where production of the things family wanted was still taking place in homes and only beginning to emerge out of the family. I also show then how the methodologies that emerged, household expenditure studies, consumer price indices, and other accounts of consumer-oriented protections against producers, weights and measures, and a range of other things, defenses of social insurance against accident, illness, etc., for families who couldn't afford it. All of these were proposed by the old family economists. But I also show that this was a period where somebody like Christine Frederick could become a voice for the period with her book Selling Mrs. Consumer. And it seemed that status of women, as Alison Comish-Thorne put, was a respectable concept, whereas by the 1930s the term feminism had acquired a negative connotation. And so I wanted to remind the feminist historians of economic thought who've been interested in recovering this very interesting work that these early old family economists, as I call them in my book, were not feminist at all, even if they played a very important role in trying to support women in traditional gendered structures to rationalize their consumption. Margaret Reed would teach radical literature to her students. True, yes, definitely. But she thought that Charlotte Gilman Perkins's advocation and defense of a common table for many families to share meals at in a cooperative sense was a misunderstanding of what families wanted. Families didn't want this, she thought. So yes, study it, but it was not going to be something that would be practical in the gendered societies in which people lived. And so even in their own times, these women, amazing women who supported their female students, were criticized for being not critical enough of the structures of gender and merely trying to help families as they existed to consume better rather than questioning the structures around which that may have benefited from being changed. So I wanted to show that these were not feminist thinkers, even on understandings of feminism in their own times, because it would be unfair to ask of them to be feminist in more recent ways, since feminism is itself a very very different in different periods. My second favorite chapter is what I think will be more controversial to people. And this is a claim that I make in this book, that the early household economics of Gary Becker, in part Jacob Mintz's More Human Capital, but Theodore Schultz, I also count as part of this tradition, building between the old family economics and the new. I say, let me just get to that part of the book.
Miriam,
Yes.
time is running.
So, yes. So I try to show that the new family economics is a very different conception of poverty that played a political role in rejecting key traditional theories of how to respond to poverty during the war on poverty in Lyndon Johnson's period. The feminist family then allows me to look at how the very late introduction to feminism, to economics of feminism in the late 1980s and 1990s, very late to come to economics relative to other disciplines, led to a focus on the family as a provider of care, and it's a crucial part of the economy, but one that needed also to respond to gendered injustices inside the family and in society that were the result of the family. And finally, I pick up, in closing, and this is the last thing I'll say, Manuela, I promise. I've picked up on Gary Becker's very interesting conversation with Francois Ewald and Bernard Harcourt at the end of his life, where they challenge him as Foucauldians, as students of Foucault. Foucault really loved Gary Becker's theory of consumption and the idea of Z goods, but they challenge him to say, well, isn't human capital itself an idea that belongs to potentially eugenic history? And he accepts that the idea of human capital and the family's role in supporting human capital development is a fiction that he thinks is useful for us, and he accepts that it may not be so useful for us in the future. So I use this to ask, well, what are the kind of fictions that would be useful to us as economic thinkers if we're concerned about families that have a different form in the context of ecosystem collapse? And I entitle that provocatively Fictions for a Future. And I end with the ecofeminist Donna Haraway, who challenges us to think about family through chosen kin and not in the forms that we've seen family take in the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Miriam, for this very fascinating presentation. Now, Giandomenica, for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I really enjoyed reading your book. As you can see, there are many post-it on it. So
Oh my goodness.
I did my own work. So
I've got yours here too.
I will be, oh, thanks so much. I will be quick because I can imagine many questions from the floor. But I really want to stress a couple of things. First, this book is very useful for historians of economic thought, for the reasons that Miriam mentioned in her presentation. But it's also very useful for feminist economists. And I'm going to explain why this interconnection between history of economic thought and feminist economics is well represented by this book. A book that is not simply a thematic focus, but it's very important from a methodological point of view. Because Miriam read the canonical economists as well as the reformers, home economists, feminist thinkers, and also policy advocates, by showing that the debate about family and poverty have always been inseparable from the debate, implicit or explicit, on social reproduction. This is a key point. So the family in this book is not simply as a background institution for economic phenomena, but it's a conceptual hinge connecting market process to moral and political judgment. And in fact, the title is not just economics and the family, but a social and political history of how economists finally dealt with the political role of the family. So it's a kind of a guide, Michelin guide in the history of economic thought to understand the role and the role of family in the analysis of economists, always connected with poverty. Poverty has been analyzed through the lens of family life, so fertility, dependency ratios, labor supply within households, intergenerational transmission of possible potential disadvantage, and so forth. So from the 19th century onwards, Miriam stressed the fact that economists too often interpreted poverty as a consequence of family imprudence, especially excessive fertility, insufficient insights, foresights for the future, and so forth. So the family has always been either an object of sympathy, but also an object of suspicion. And this duality, Miriam well explained, shaped debates about demography, about welfare, about economic policy. So by placing the interconnection between poverty and family at the center, the book exposes how economic theory relied on normative models of the family that has been typically heterosexual, male breadwinner, and reproductive. So as Miriam mentioned, a substantial portion of the book has been devoted to famous, well-known economists such as Barras, Pareto, Marshall, and Becker, by stressing their specific contribution on the analysis of the family. For example, Marshall distanced himself from Christian socialist approaches. He emphasized the character formation, the education, the self-restraint, but also endorses Malthus' call for a demographic restraint. So basically, for both of them, poverty was linked with excessive fertility and insufficient prudence among the working class. Care was basically not a matter of redistributive justice, but a matter of self-governance within the families. Also, Miriam devoted a lot of space to the analysis of the notion of a male breadwinner wage by showing that there were many critiques on that notion, and especially it's worthy to remember the work of Eleanor Rathbone, who argued that raising male wages alone could not solve poverty and family poverty. In fact, Rathbone advocated family allowances paid directly to mothers, recognizing that household income distribution mattered. And it's worthy to note that Keynes endorsed her position, marking a convergence between macroeconomic reform of the time and a more recent feminist social economic policy. About Barras and Pareto, Miriam already talked about them and their contributions. So I'm not reminding anything about that, as well as about Becker. Yet I want to stress the fact that in this book it's also important to have interconnected not just family and poverty, but also to have introduced the notion of race. In fact, debates about welfare and fertility often carried racialist racialized assumptions, framing certain family forms as pathological. By bringing race into the narrative, Miriam demonstrates that economic discourse must be a discourse grounded on intersectionalities, with a special vision on hierarchies. So it's a book able to make the proper connection between economics and other social sciences in describing the history of ideas around family, poverty, race, and also other aspects such as, for example, gender in general, which includes non-traditional heterosexual families, which is precisely the final part of the book. As I mentioned earlier, the book is very interesting also for feminist economists, such as there are many interconnections between Miriam's work and the works by Folbre, Agarwal, Elson, Nelson, Bergman, and so forth. And about that, I'm concluding by asking to Miriam a specific question, which is related with chapter 6. In chapter 6, you have selected some contemporary approach, mainly by feminist economists, about the recentering poverty and gender within the framework of the analysis of feminists. So in these selected approaches that you have chosen, which one is for you the most available, the best for facing the challenge of today's families, especially families within poverty?
Thank you very much, Giandomenica. So, Miriam, let's wait for a couple of questions
Thank you.
before you